excited to be here with you today. It's been much too long since we last caught up. I think we first met 10 or 11 years ago at a marketing event. I know we were on the same circuit for a while, going to different Dreamforces. I remember hearing your keynote in Atlanta at the Entrepreneurs Organization event, probably 2010 or 11. And so it's great to reconnect. It's great to be here with you.
Great to be here with you too, David. Looking forward to the chat.
I feel like in the MarTech world, we're like the grandfathers. You know, you starting HubSpot back in 2004, Adam and I starting Pardot back in 2007. Now you look at the landscape of MarTech, and there's 8,000 or 9,000 different MarTech companies. So, you know, it's fun to watch the industry grow. How have you sort of evolved over time with HubSpot? Tell us a little bit about the origin story and how it came to be.
Sure. HubSpot was started when I was in grad school. I met my co-founder there at MIT, and the company wasn't actually supposed to happen. And the reason it wasn't supposed to happen is because I told my wife after I sold my first startup that I would never do that ever again. And my whole purpose for going to grad school was to kind of have that be the next stage of my life, and then I was going to go on and teach, and that was the original plan. And I had promised her I would not do, because I'd lived the proverbial entrepreneurial life, as many of us know, for over a decade in my first startup. And the reason we ended up doing it, and when I say we, I mean Brian, my co-founder, and I, is that we had a shared passion for SMB. We didn't exactly know that we were going to do a MarTech company, and we didn't know what it was going to be, but we liked each other, and we both had a bit of a chip on our shoulder. So we had modest success in our careers, but we hadn't really had a home run yet. It's like, okay, we've got one more kind of left in us. We have a point to prove, and had a shared passion for SMB. And so we decided to start the company before we knew exactly what it was we were going to do. We knew it was going to be in and around the SMB space. And then probably within the first 6 months or so, we decided that it was going to be marketing software.
You know, talking in the venture world and the startup world, SMB is usually, an area that is discouraged to be started in. So what was the draw for SMB?
From a personal perspective, I grew up in enterprise software and had some success there. And the way kind of we saw the kind of software landscape is on the kind of enterprise side, you could charge money, but it was a slog in terms of there were good years all the way through the 90s, but around the 2005 or 6 timeframe when we were talking about this, enterprise software had just gotten hard. The sales cycles were really long, feedback loop was really long. It was just not fun. And the other end of the spectrum, if you did a consumer software company, that was basically like buying a lottery ticket. Like, yeah, 1 out of 100 were going to be the next Facebook, the next whatever, but there was no real middle ground. Either you kind of made a massive success or you were nothing at all, because you couldn't really monetize that easily. And so you had to kind of really squint to see what the business model would be. The thing we liked about SMB was it was a happy medium. It's like, it didn't have to be a lottery ticket. You could actually charge real money for solving real problems, and you could kind of scale it as you went and see the feedback from the business. So that was the appeal. And you're right, even now, but especially then, SMB was frowned upon. Every investor we talked to, our board meeting, everyone would ask us, it's like, okay, we know you started an SMB, but what are your plans for going into the enterprise? And we would provide the same answer, and have been for 14 years, is that we have no plans to go into the enterprise in the classic sense, that we're very much focused on SMB. Now, good news now for entrepreneurs starting, I would encourage you to seriously look at SMB. There are lots of positives, one of which is that short sales cycle is more fun. But now that we've had some kind of precedence, it's not as hard as it used to be to start a company in the SMB space. Acquisition costs have gone down. You can actually build a reliable kind of SaaS business. And there's still lots of problems out there to be solved in SMB.
So I started a SaaS company in the year 2000 called Super Update, doing basically what Wix and Squarespace and those types of companies do today. So I was much too early, and I definitely had a very hard time in the SMB space. So from a HubSpot point of view, I remember back in probably 2010 reading about HubSpot raising this big round of capital at this valuation that was north of $100 million. And we were just aghast that, this MarTech company in Boston could do so well. And now you look at the MarTech industry today, what's changed? Why is MarTech so popular? Why is it so big compared to when we were first starting, 10, 15 years ago?
Yeah, it's a really good question. So if you look down the P&L of any major company, this was true 15 years ago when we started, and I think it's still true now, is that every line item on the P&L, there was a $10+ billion software company that was a globally known brand. You had SAP, you had every single line item. It's like if there was a department for it, there was a massive software company behind it, except for marketing. Marketing continued to be a really large spend, but there were no big SAP level, Oracle level software companies in marketing. And so the question is, well, why was that? And the answer is there didn't really need to be a MarTech software company because marketing at the time was a very artsy, craftsy business. You had a relatively small number of people with a maybe a large budget, but it wasn't a problem that software was particularly good at solving. It's like it's the artsy, craftsy. Maybe there was some project management. Fast forward, a decade, and now marketing looks a lot like ERP or supply chain optimization or all these things that have big global software brands behind them because it's very analytical. There's lots of data to process, and it looks exactly like an industry that marketing should be able to help with. And I think that's why we've seen this enormous growth in the industry is because it's a problem that software is actually very good at solving, and we just hadn't solved it yet. So it was. So now I think we're living in kind of the renaissance for marketing. Is that, and this is the reason why there's so much energy in the startup world and even the scale-up world. It's real.
So you mentioned SAP. SAP is obviously the oldest publicly traded software company in the world, has such a long history of success. And I know one of the things that you and Brian have talked about is building an anchor company, a company that your grandkids could really be excited about. Where did that origin for that particular piece come from?
Yeah, it's interesting. We wanted to build what we thought of as a kind of a real sustainable company here in the Boston area. We're both, at least I have been for better part of a dozen years now from the Boston area. But partly it was just driven by just having an actual impact in building a real company. And we had, and as I mentioned, both of us had some modest success. And the only way we could reconcile in our head why we would start a company, why do something so crazy, was certainly not to make money. It's that we felt like the Boston area had kind of missed out on a generation of software evolution and the kind of whole internet days, and that we needed kind of more anchor companies in the area, and we wanted to build an impactful, sustainable company. It was just kind of simple. We didn't know that we would pull it off at the time, but having that discussion, and I think all founders should have this discussion in the early days, weeks, and months, is around like what it is that you're out to do, what does success look like? And there's nothing wrong with building, and I advise founders all the time, especially first-time ones, there's nothing wrong with selling a company, nothing wrong with like shutting it down if it's not working. But we want to take our shot at it. That was, it's like we want to build something real. This was going to be our last one. We knew that. And I've been around startups long enough to know that it doesn't always work out. Sometimes timing is wrong. Sometimes the idea is wrong. And sometimes the founders are just not good enough. It happens. But yeah.
So do you think having the success for your first software company, which I believe is in Alabama, correct me if I'm wrong,
yep,
having that first win under your belt made it so that when you went back to the plate, when you got back into the arena, you were really going to do it for more than money, more than just proving that you could, but really to make an impact on the community. How did you develop that sort of sentiment? Was there a parent or a mentor or an influence on you that helped instill some of those?
Not really. Like even my first one, I didn't really do it for the money. There were easier ways to actually make money. The first one was because I was a software engineer, and I sort of knew what software engineers cared about and wanted to do. And I was working for a software company at the time, but I just didn't think they were doing it particularly well in terms of motivating software engineers. So even at that time when I did that first company in Alabama, I just didn't know exactly where the path would lead. And if you had done a survey of my family, which is a relatively large sample size from India, they would have probably voted me least likely to ever start a company. That's not part of my psyche, it's not part of my makeup. So the only reason I did it was just, for lack of a better term, control. Just like, okay, I think there's a better way to motivate software engineers. There are enough problems out there to solve, and then we'll kind of figure out things as they go, which we ended up doing. And the company I don't talk about, so this HubSpot's actually my third startup. The first one did reasonably well. That's where I kind of made my money. The second one started right around the dot-com boom and bust days. And that one was a swing and a miss. The funny thing is, when I did that second one, the thing I told myself was like, oh yeah, my first one, I was such a rookie back then, I didn't know anything. I'm going to do it so differently this time. Because I had my single, it's like, oh, that was a hit, but it's going to be so much better. And I did things almost the opposite, like in a George Costanza style. I'm going to do it differently. And as it turns out, that was wrong. A lot of the lessons, even though I knew nothing about software startups or anything like that back when I was in my early 20s on the first one, they ended up being right. And so HubSpot's kind of a mix of those two experiences. It's the kind of bootstrappy, scrappy, there's nothing wrong with being resourceful and you don't need to spend money like drunken sailors in order to succeed. Combined with the kind of let's be ambitious, let's figure out what it is we're trying to solve for and see if we can kind of thread the needle and get there. It's a weird path.
That's interesting. Yeah, I've heard after you've had your first success, that hubris, that sense of invincibility, it probably was, in hindsight, something that helped so that your third startup, HubSpot, which has obviously been a wild, amazing success, was that much sweeter and that much better. And so I bet having that hiccup in the interim was probably beneficial in the grand scheme of things.
Yeah, I think it was. It's just, it kind of cemented in my mind, and you kind of learn as you go. And I made a ton of mistakes on that second one that you would have thought, and I thought I was actually improving. I thought I was iterating on things I'd learned in the first one. And the reality is I was just second guessing myself and assuming that just because it was the first time I was doing it, that there was actually a better way. And, and it was partly because of the sign of the times as we were going through the kind of, it wasn't a .com company, but was going through that kind of big upcycle. It's easy to kind of tell yourself a narrative that, oh yeah, like this is no longer the time of scrappy resourcefulness or whatever. Everybody has to kind of swing for the fences at all times. It's I
remember in early 2011, we sat down for dinner and we did a deep dive.
Yep.
You and I and Adam and Brian, and we had a great dinner. And I remember during that dinner, you talked about Website Grader. And at the time, this is probably January of 2011. At the time, you were generating 60,000 new leads a month just off of Website Grader. And so again, it just blew my mind that you were generating 60,000 leads a month in January of 2011. And it got me thinking about Website Grader, and it got me thinking about the inbound marketing book that you wrote, and then the amazing culture deck that you put together. Where does this inspiration come from, and what excites you today?
I like to think of myself as a builder of things and a tinkerer, all software based. I have no hardware knowledge, can't even hold a hammer, I don't think. But I like to kind of fix inefficiencies. Those are things that kind of keep me up at night, is when things and there's kind of two levels of inefficiency. There's the kind of what I think of as like the atomic inefficiency. It's like, oh, I'm doing this thing, I'm just doing it very inefficiently. That's where Website Grader was kind of born, is to like kind of automate some of that process, because all the things that were in Website Grader, which for those that don't know, it's like a diagnostic tool. You put your website in and it told you kind of how well you did in terms of marketing on the internet. So that was solve the inefficiency that I personally had. And the other kind of inefficiency, which I've started working on over time, is what I think of as a market inefficiency. And that's when people or entities that should be coming together are not, simply because they don't know about each other. There's not enough trust. And so that's what the book sort of solves. That's what HubSpot sort of solves in many ways. And that's kind of the next chapter for me in terms of thinking through in the industry, what are those inefficiencies still left to be solved? And what can I build to help solve them?
One of the things that I've seen more discussion as of late is, sort of inbound marketing 2.0. I've seen the flywheel talked about quite a bit, but I've also seen this idea of how do you develop a relationship with your community, with your potential customer, with your customer. How do you think that plays into sort of modern day marketing, this idea of relationship building?
I think that's what marketing is really kind of coming down to, right? Which is, so the inbound marketing was, a lot of it was the kind of the content story, right? Which is add value before you extract value. That's what Website Grader was an inbound marketing play. But I think marketing is now turning into, how do you kind of forge those early relationships with people that may not know about you? That might start as a brand play that says, okay, now they've kind of heard the name of the company, but at some point you have to have a kind of usable relationship with a prospect, someone that you think may buy from you, and it may be years before they actually do. That's one of the nice things about efficient marketing, that says you can afford to kind of invest in a relationship for a long time, and then eventually, I think, reap the rewards and aggregate over time. But that's what it really is about now. And I think, I guess I have a slight bias since I'm in the kind of customer engagement marketing CRM space. But even if I weren't, I think most businesses that are doing well now are kind of learning the value of those relationships. And we've talked from an economics perspective in the SaaS industry about lifetime value. And I think one of the mistakes we've made as an industry is we think about lifetime value for an individual company. It's like, oh, I'm trying to sell to Acme widgets, And when I do, the lifetime value is going to be X based on my churn rate and the money they pay me per month, per year, whatever it is. And that's only partly the answer, right? The lifetime value is actually of the individual, because that's who you're actually forging a relationship with. So if you look across any industry, and it varies, people are going to change jobs 3.7 times in their career. They're going to go to different companies. And the question is, will they carry your brand, your relationship with them? Do they feel like they have a relationship with you that then transcends the individual company they happen to be working with, and they can kind of continue on wherever they happen to go? And I think that's forward-thinking companies are starting to think about now, is how do we kind of build that relationship early and maintain that relationship over time. So, yeah.
I agree. Yeah, too often people say, oh, you're selling to a business, or the business buys from another business, but it's really people buying from other people. And during the Pardot days and some of the subsequent startups that I've been involved with, that second order revenue, as technical as that sounds, has been so important. This idea that you develop a relationship with one person that buys from one company, and then that person moves to the next company, and then they buy from you again because they had a great experience, because you solved their problems in a meaningful way. And so this idea of the relationship with the person, and then how that transcends whatever company he or she might be at, I think is a really important point.
Yeah, and I think the other thing, it is absolutely the other thing. I think we, and there's, I can argue both sides of this one. I'll argue we sometimes become myopically focused on what the company happens to be doing right now and whether this person can bring us value right now. The reality is most startups will actually go through some iterations. Even the successful ones don't resemble the thing that they actually originally started with, right? So it's okay to have some relationships that may not completely fit the thing you're trying to sell right now. It's like, okay, unless it's completely within our target demographic, this relationship is valueless to us. I think that's short-term thinking. I think over time, an increasing percentage of people, based on whatever products and offerings you might have in the future, might be a good fit. Yeah.
So I'm going to change gears just a tiny bit and go into, let's call it marketing in advance of the product. So one of the things that HubSpot did really well in the early years was paint a vision, paint a picture, and talk about inbound marketing and where marketing's going, and some of these concepts we've already talked about. But from a product point of view, for several years, the product wasn't as good as the vision was. What are your thoughts on sometimes getting out ahead of the market from a vision side and then playing catch up on the product? And how have your thoughts on that evolved over the years?
Yeah, I think, I've always, as a software engineer, and this is, I think, commonly shared now, so this is not a novel position, is that we most of us believe in the kind of release early, release often, right? Get something out there, because the only real way to know whether you've solved a real problem in a meaningful way is when you start kind of interacting with customers. So I think we mostly agree, the industry agrees now, that that's a better way to do it. I think we can kind of pull on that particular thread and say, okay, well, if the goal is to kind of learn more about the customers and whether there's an actual market there, maybe you start telling the story before the product and figure out whether there's even interest there in a product that you might actually build and solve the problem with. And I think if I had to do it all over again, I would still do that. No one wants their product to suck in the early years. Ours did for the longest time, and it was partly because we were just so broad, and partly it was just early stage software. So that's how that plays out. But I think just kind of telling the story and forcing yourself to kind of articulate the thing it is you're trying to do. Two things happen. One is you get much crisper on the thing you're actually trying to do, because you're forced to actually describe it to someone outside your own head, right? Or outside your founding team. And then over time, so the act of writing, I think, or just articulating it, narrating the story, helps a lot. But then one thing that the internet is exceptionally good at is telling you why you're an idiot, right? It's like, oh, here are all the things why that doesn't make sense, or this won't happen, or whatever. And that's great. That's like priceless feedback. So I would encourage entrepreneurs, if you haven't, and I think one of the biggest mistakes, I think probably less common now, but it's still shockingly common, is people, it's like, oh, I'm still in stealth mode, so I'm not really talking about my vision or the thing I'm doing because someone else is going to steal that idea. Statistically, that almost never happens. Like, I've been in the startup world for a better part of 20 years now. I've interacted with hundreds of entrepreneurs. Almost never it's like, oh yeah, I had this idea and I told some people, or I published a blog post, and then another company did exactly that same thing. The actual experience most entrepreneurs will have is that you will have this idea and you will start iterating. It's called building your team, and you're going to spend the rest of your time convincing your team that the idea you're actually pursuing is worth pursuing, let alone someone else saying, oh yeah, we want to do exactly that. That just doesn't happen. And there's just so much upside to sharing the idea and getting the thoughts out there and getting that critical feedback. And that's even cheaper than writing early software to get it out there. Just write early blog posts and just kind of refine the vision before you go too far with the product.
Absolutely. Well, that's a good segue into writing blog posts and writing content. I've been a big fan of the On Startups website that you've had for a number of years. What was that initial idea to start blogging, to start putting it out there for the world?
Pure self-interest. So when I was in grad school, part of my graduation requirements, I had to write a thesis. It's like, okay, well, I'd never written a thesis or a graduate paper before, so I went off and wrote a bunch of stuff that was in my head. And the title of my thesis was On Startups, the Patterns and Practices of Modern Software Entrepreneurs. And the idea was like, oh, here's how software has changed now. I thought at the time, like, this is the way software is going to start to look. And I put it down, and it's like, okay, well, here's the paper. And my thesis advisor, who was the chair of the Entrepreneurship Center, Professor Ed Roberts, said, Darmesh, I mean, this is good, but this is all basically your opinion. There's no data in here. Like, it's not a real thesis, it's not a graduate paper. I'm like, crap. What he's talking about sounds like it's going to involve me like interacting with people. That seems awfully unpleasant for an introvert like me. And so I had heard about blogging. Like, I know what I'll do. I'll actually put some of these ideas out there, and then I'll have an audience that I can do some surveys or whatever, and I can use that and then bring that data back and add it to the paper and graduate. That was so I took the first two words of the thesis title, stuck them together, saw if the domain was available, which at the time it was, and then that's the beginning of my blogging career, so to speak.
That's awesome. I mentioned this to you a long, long time ago, but in 1999, I owned the domain name onstartup.com, and I let it lapse, unfortunately. But 21 years ago, I had a very, very similar domain to the one that you acquired as well. So let's talk about angel investing a little bit. How did you get involved in angel investing, and what are some of the experiences over the years, some of the lessons learned on that front?
Yeah, so the reason I started it was because HubSpot wasn't supposed to happen. So my plan when I was still in graduate school was like, okay, I'm not going to do another startup, because I told my wife I was not going to do another startup. But I love startups. And I had heard about this thing called angel investing. And as it turns out, there are no laws in terms of or certifications that you have to kind of pass, no degrees you need in order to do angel investing. You just have to have write checks and be able to have the risk tolerance to be able to write checks. And so I was like, okay, we'll live vicariously through other entrepreneurs by doing angel investing. So I still get some of the thrill. And it's a little bit like having nieces and nephews. Like, you get to play with them and they're awfully fun, and then you hand them back at the end of the day. It's like, oh, I'm done here. I can go back to my life. That was the plan. So I started angel investing, and my first two investments were classmates of mine at MIT at the time. And then when HubSpot started, I'm a big believer in focus. I'm like, this is not going to work. I can't do the angel investing thing and do HubSpot. And so I set ground rules for myself, which is, okay, I'll continue to do this, but I'm going to solve for time, not money, which is I'm going to try to minimize in extreme ways how much time I spend with entrepreneurs, because that's not the thing I'm trying to solve. I'm trying to build this thing called HubSpot. And so I had the no due diligence. Most decisions turn around within 24 hours. 90% of the deals that I've done, I've never met the founders, never talked to them on the phone. And it seems a little bit crazy. I never do follow-ons because that required due diligence, because I have to kind of pick of the ones that I've invested in, which ones I'm going to invest in, which is all kind of, takes time, which I did not have, and I was solving to try and minimize. So it's been a weird angel investment journey. I've done probably around 80 investments now, give or take. But I would, all modesty aside, I would put my portfolio and my track record, as random as it was, up against most early stage investors. I'm happy with it. I got from it exactly what I wanted, which is I did get to participate vicariously. I got to meet a bunch of awesome entrepreneurs that I've known over the years, over time, and then just the bragging rights to be able to say, oh yeah, like I knew them back then. Not only did I know them, but I invested, and that's awesome. Because I, like most humans, have a bit of an ego.
It sounds like you were way ahead of your time in terms of 24-hour turnarounds. I mean, back when I was raising money 10, 12 years ago, we were lucky if we got to a decision within, 3 to 6 months. And then obviously the market changed and it got faster and faster and more capital entered the market. So everything I'm hearing from your strategy and position really is where the market ended up going. So, kudos to you for seeing, what the future was going to hold and go ahead and getting it done early and often. So
the thing I asked myself even back then, if I were the entrepreneur, it's like, yes, you would love to have, advice and mentorship, and that's great. And there are places they can get that. But sometimes it's like, you know what? You just want someone to have a little bit of faith in you and the idea, just write you the check so you can just go on with the business of, and you'll fumble and you'll make some mistakes, but just go do that. And time is precious. One of the worst things about being a venture capital based startup is the amount of calories one spends raising capital across the course of the several rounds of funding that you will inevitably do. There's no company, I don't think, ever that scales that just like, oh, we did it all in one round. That just doesn't happen. So yeah.
Speaking of funding, I remember obviously following the HubSpot story closely. I remember meeting with David Skok, and he told me that he passed on your Series A, but came back and did the B round. And then obviously meeting with Jim Getz and others who, part of the Sequoia team that did, I believe, your C round and beyond. What was it like working with some of the, most famous VCs in the world? What are some lessons there?
It was awesome. So I'm a massive David Skok fan. I'm a massive fan of Jim Getz and Pat Grady at Sequoia. One thing I think we did really right in terms of our fundraising is we didn't solve for dilution or terms as long as they were fair, whatever the market happened to be at the time. We didn't overthink that, but we really overthought to an extreme degree who we brought on as investors and who was going to be on the board, because we knew that was going to matter. So we wanted people, and not just in the kind of cliched sense of, who would you want to have a beer with? It's like, who do you admire that you think you can learn from and that will have the humility to teach you and not be overbearing? Those are two things we were trying to kind of trade off on. It's like, okay, we want people that are smart enough that we'll actually learn from and have the experience, whatever, but then humble enough that we're not going to find them completely annoying and try to avoid them at all costs. And I think we did really well, through 14 years of HubSpot on that particular front. That's one thing I would advise. If you do raise funding, don't worry about the valuation as much as you think it's not going to matter. It's just not going to matter.
So going from being a fast-growing private company to going public and then a fast-growing public company, how has it changed things being public? And obviously you've been public for a number of years now, but what are some observations there?
A couple. One is things don't have to be that different. This is the first time I've ever taken a company public before. I've never done that. And just from things you read and the other folks who talk, it's like, oh, that's like the end of the road. Like that's when it stops being fun because now you're publicly traded. And Brian, my co-founder, would say the same thing. We're having more fun literally today at HubSpot. Not like we don't want to be in the middle of a global pandemic, but that notwithstanding, more fun today as a publicly traded company than even the early years of HubSpot. And then when we first had that kind of observation, we asked ourselves, like, why is that sort of weird? Because we're both startup-y people. Like, how could we possibly be happier now than we were then? And the answer is that an IPO, and people overthink it, is really just a funding round with a higher end in terms of number of investors. Mm-hmm. Yes, there's some regulations attached, but that's what it is. It's a funding round. And so for us, and we told this to the team years leading up to the IPO that we thought may or may not happen, it's like, we're still in this to win this. This is not the end of the road for us. It's another funding round that happens to be public shareholders now. And I personally like being a public company because when you're private, you're sort of at the whims of the VC market and what's going on there. And it's not completely rational. I sort of like going to bed every night, and I tell this to the team as well. So let's say your fair market value is whatever it happens to be at any particular point in time. If there were an all-knowing being that would know what the fair market value is, here's what it is. Your valuation will oscillate around that over time, right? Sometimes you'll be valued higher than what you deserve, and sometimes it'll be lower than you deserve. But over time, the market's relatively efficient.
Let's talk about, product strategy, right? A lot of companies that are at your size and scale would start acquiring other companies and doing M&A and that kind of expansion. And mostly you've built new products internally and expanded the platform, mostly homegrown, a few acquisitions, but mostly homegrown. What has the thought process been around that?
Yeah, so a couple of things. One is when we first started HubSpot, the crazy thing that we did, which goes contrary to all good entrepreneurial advice, which is pick your one thing and be exceptionally good at that one thing and go as deep as you can on that one thing and do that one thing. And I've given out that advice countless times. And HubSpot did the exact opposite. Like, we're going to do all the things. We're going to build a content management system, social media tools, and a blogging tool, and analytics, and SEO, all of it in year one, right? That was and the reason behind that was like, okay, well, if we're going to be an SMB, in talking to customers, the issue in SMB was not that there were not great products in all those categories, is that it was just too hard. It was just too hard for them to kind of piece all those things together. So our kind of founding vision was, we're going to solve the actual customer problem that people have, which is it's too hard to do this stuff. So even if the individual products suck, in aggregate, putting them all together and making it easy for customers will be enough to differentiate and to build a business around. Now, so we hold on to that, right? So hold on to that thought, which is you have to make it easy, founding principle. One of the reasons I think people buy HubSpot, and this works especially well in SMB, is it has to be easy. And I think if we had done a lot of M&A and just kind of bolted products on over the years, it's certainly a growth strategy. It's worked for famous companies before, but it's just not us. We don't think that we would be able to kind of maintain that cohesion and that simplicity if we had just done acquisitions along the way and kind of bolted them on. So we've kind of organically grown the platform. And the acquisitions we have done is either for talent or to plug a technology that would be kind of behind the scenes on the back end versus impacting what we think of as like the surface area, the UI to the customer of HubSpot. So we're kind of standing behind that. It's worked well for us. We think in SMB land, people value that simplicity much more than the depth on any individual feature.
So Dharmesh, I really enjoyed our conversation today. It was great to catch up. We should do it more often. This is fun. I'm a software geek just like you are, and I could spend all day having this conversation with you, but we got to turn it back over to Trey and Brooke. So back at you guys. Thanks for having us.
Thanks for having us.